We get most of our information about climate change from the media. Reporters, editors, and broadcasters have the power to tell us what to think about and how to think about it. But with that power comes responsibility. Responsibility to warn people about climate impacts, but also responsibility to show them the opportunities that a low-carbon world can offer. In this session, our panellists will answer the question, what is the media's role in tackling the climate crisis?
Great, thank you for that introduction, Dave, and I'm delighted to be kicking off this first session. And what I'm going to be talking about today is primarily based around a study that I did with Dave last year. It was published, and we wanted to explore the role of environment correspondents in particular. And two points to make broadly about these roles in particular and how they fit into newsrooms. Like, we know from existing research that having a dedicated environment correspondent is one of the most important things in ensuring a consistent level of coverage of the environment day to day among news outlets. So having that dedicated role is key. And the second point is that, especially now, we see, I think, that as environment issues start to permeate other areas, other beats, we know that these dedicated environment correspondents can become experts within the newsroom, and that other reporters will turn to them for guidance and how to make sense of what's happening with so many of these climate and environment issues. So there, I think, just two kind of starting points to help set the scene. And we wanted with this study to understand a little bit more about the particulars of environment journalists. So we spoke to 13 environment correspondents. You'll see the list up here from some of the biggest outlets, the BBC, The Guardian, and from in Ireland as well, the Irish Times, the Irish Independent. And so across the UK, the US, and Ireland. And the full paper is open access and freely available. You can see it up here. But today, I'm just going to focus on 3 points, I think, which speak hopefully to this panel about how the media can respond, and in particular, the news media and newsrooms and journalists to the climate challenge. So the first point, as I say, there's 3 points. The first one I want to make is simply around the complexity of covering climate issues. Many of our interviewees spoke about the sheer number of stakeholders and actors now involved in this sector. And these are all fighting for attention and fighting for their message to get heard. But coupled with that is the technicality of the science, the evidence, the data that these correspondents are trying to navigate and make sense of. And I have some of these listed up here, but one quote from one of the journalists we spoke to, Emily Holden from The Guardian in the US, she explained the reality of what this means day to day for environment correspondents in terms of the breadth of what they have to cover. You know, I can write a story on sea level rise one day, endangered birds the next, and then oil and gas extraction the next day, air pollutants the next day. I know a lot about electricity, I know a lot about climate impacts and causes, a lot about air pollution, but then I'm expected to be also an expert on drinking water, storm wastewater, cyclones. So there's just so much day to day for these journalists to be on top of and to be able to speak with authority on. And this isn't unique to the environment, but these journalists were grappling with this, decades ago. And one of them who I spoke to described how trying to navigate this environment, especially in the environmental field, is indicative of where journalism is becoming less art and more science. And even beyond the environment, I think we're seeing that more, that audiences expect evidence for the stories and the claims that they're seeing and they're hearing in media. So climate and environment journalists are very familiar with this. And I think from a newsroom perspective then, it's acknowledging the expertise that is needed to report on these issues and to invest in that. And to not take this knowledge for granted and think that it can be replaced or that anybody can cover this. We're seeing that it is being covered broadly by lots of different journalists in different fields, which is really important. But that baseline knowledge is so important to have authority within your newsroom to be able to make sense of these complex issues and these various stakeholders. So that, I think, is the first point. The second relates to simply keeping climate issues visible and on the news agenda. Within media studies and agenda setting theory, there's a well-known phrase that the media don't tell people what to think, but they certainly tell them what to think about, and they make clear what the important issues of the day are. So I think in that regard, it's so important that climate and environment issues stay to the fore of the agenda and regularly appear. And this is like what I was saying about the importance of having dedicated correspondents who ensure and who fight in news meetings to make sure that this is on the agenda each day. And we know also that it can be really hard. The nature of climate change stories, as I have up here, climate stories do not break, they ooze. They're slower moving. And in some ways that clashes with a lot of traditional newsroom values, where immediacy is prioritised. Different news values seem to take precedence. One journalist said to me, of course people care about 2050, but they care about tomorrow more. And that culture, I think, permeates newsrooms as well, where something immediate that's happening, that bumps off maybe something else that's more abstract or more long-term, which a lot of the kind of climate-related stories are. So I think fighting for editors and managers to keep it regularly in the news. There were some concerns from our journalists that COVID was kind of going to pull them away from covering climate and environment. And they felt that maybe that COVID could be a critical moment. And some of them, especially the older journalists, reflected on a sense of optimism that so at the moment we kind of feel that we might have reached a critical point where there's general public awareness and mass acceptance that this is a huge issue to be tackled. But some, as I say, the older journalists reflected on a similar period that they felt real positive waves around the COP in 2009 in Copenhagen, and that enthusiasm that they saw within the media field kind of dissipated slightly, which was disheartening for them. But Matt McGrath from the BBC, one of the journalists we interviewed, he kind of was more positive in this. And he was saying, I think this is different now. And even if, we are in the teeth of a desperate recession. So these interviews took place September 2020, where, we were still very much in the height of trying to make sense of what the repercussions of COVID would be. But he was saying that, the changes in the fundamental production of energy, food, treating the planet, protecting nature, he argued that there is an acceptance that these are huge now. And he felt that, we're not going back from here. And he said that even if we have this terrible recession post-COVID, we hopefully, we'll actually get to continue to report on the environment as well. And I think that that's a really important takeaway, that it's no longer an either or, and it's not either we cover COVID or the environment. I think we're seeing that now with Russia and Ukraine in particular, that the discourse around energy supply is part of the story and leading to then bigger conversations about energy and environment repercussions and energy sources. So it's not an either or. And I think we're seeing that environment, as I mentioned, is permeating other areas. So to keep it to the fore. The third then and kind of final main point relates to how journalists are covering this issue. And journalists are generally, quite idealistic and have very strong professional values in their work. And to the fore of that is often an idea of objectivity, an idea of balance, an idea of being neutral. But that clashes, or has the potential to clash somewhat with what many of our journalists pointed out, was that they do believe that there is need for climate action. And this was articulated very well actually by Kevin O'Sullivan, who I see here, that logic and scientific evidence would impel you to be an activist, but I'm a journalist, so therefore I don't go to that extent in terms of what I do. And those boundaries came across really strongly, that these journalists, although they believe in the need for action, there were still very strong professional identities about what they do and how they do their job. And some felt that, this idea of being an activist was something that other people put on them, but they resisted that. As Caroline O'Doherty said here, people tend to think that you want to run Greenpeace and save the world if you are involved in the environment and as a journalist here. So they resisted that kind of identity being put on them, but they also resisted this idea that you can somehow have a view from nowhere and that somehow the idea of the need for climate action is still up for debate and needs to be both sides, so to speak. So they really did resist that, and we've seen that, and we know as well from research that climate and environment is one of the kind of the first fields to reconceptualize how we understand objectivity in journalism, and that there are really dangerous repercussions of presenting a simplified, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. So climate journalists have really led the idea that we need to reorientate how we understand balance in journalism, because most journalists are still committed to that. So a kind of more sophisticated understanding of objectivity. And some of them pointed to how even among activists and advocacy groups that there is misinformation. Some of the claims aren't scientifically grounded. So they kind of bring what can be thought of as sort of a universal skepticism to the work that they do, these professional values. And regardless of who the source is, they still try to hold them and verify the information, which again is a key journalistic principle. And Fiona Harvey from The Guardian explained this really well, I think, saying, the people who think of themselves as the angels, the NGOs and activists, you subject them to the same scrutiny that you would ExxonMobil or BP. So I think that those professional values permeate even among journalists who believe that, yes, we do need to take action here. So just to kind of wrap this up and conclude and link it back to this panel about how the media can respond to the climate challenge, and specifically news media in my case. For editors and managers in newsrooms, I suppose the first thing is to invest and recognise the value of expertise and having people in the newsroom who understand what they're talking about. As I've said, it's complicated, it's hard, you need breadth and depth of knowledge, and that requires investment. So I think that is the first thing. Linked as well to that is even among existing staff who maybe aren't formally working on the environment beat, these issues are permeating everywhere. So help elevate these journalists' understanding around, as I say here, the basics of climate science, navigating data, understanding scientific research. So upskilling, so investing in that training. It is hard, but it requires that investment. On a broader picture, think about trying to keep it on the news agenda. Don't let it get crowded out, as I'd say, by other issues that might feel more immediate, especially in the short term. And consider it's not a case of abandoning this idea of objectivity. It's just being mindful about what does that mean in practice. And I'd really urge to resist moving out to the fringes in order to get, both sides of a story. Avoid the extremes and kind of seek a more constructive middle ground, because I think we've seen some of the worst, or glimpses of the worst of that regarding some of the discourse around turf cutting in recent weeks, that we've gone to the fringes to find one extreme and the other, when really I urge journalists and editors to be focusing on that constructive middle ground where you can hold these actors to account, but without kind of going to extremes. And around editorial policies as well. And these are very practical things then about having style guides around how do we illustrate if there's a heat wave? Do we use pictures of people having a great time on the beach and present this as a really positive story? Around language, using terms like the national herd. Some of these can be quite loaded, and trying to explore what does this actually mean? The national herd suggests a sense of collective identity and ownership, and so to just be mindful of those. And then to finish on a positive, to realise that we're actually in a very good position here in Ireland, I think, and our journalists in the US especially spoke of a lot of frustration in trying to communicate these issues. The UK was sort of in between us. There's, some hostility, but on the whole, there's broadly a high acceptance of science here. We see some controversies and some tensions maybe over urban and rural divides. But on the whole, we know that broadly in Ireland, there's a high acceptance that climate change is a serious issue. And crucially for us on this panel, coupled with a high level of trust, which we really shouldn't take for granted relative to many other countries, even in Europe. We have high trust in media and high acceptance that climate change is a serious issue. So that's actually a really positive starting point, and a reason to be optimistic. And I suppose we'd urge that media should respond to that public openness, I suppose, accordingly and responsibly with a few of the issues I've flagged here. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. It's my first trip out for 2 weeks, so it's nice to see some other human beings. Look, I want to start by saying thank you. Thank you both for the invitation. But 18 months ago, RTE began its biggest ever marketing campaign around something rather simple: the truth. It's our job to report facts, but it's also our job to report context to help put the pieces of the jigsaw together. And last summer, RT News was criticised by some for failing to connect a series of specific weather events to climate change. Historically, linking any individual weather event to climate change has been complicated, but last summer, the shifting pattern of the jet stream meant a heat wave in North America, wildfires in the Russian Arctic, and floods in Germany and Brussels were all connected. And developments in climate attribution science meant that by failing to join the dots, by not explaining that otherwise random weather events were actually connected, we missed a piece of that jigsaw. It was an important moment. Everyone has a view on what RTE should or should not do, and it's right that you do. Often in an online world, people have absolute certainty in their own beliefs, and they want us to adopt theirs. But it's also right that we're held to account, and when we get it wrong, it's important that we say so. RTE journalists report the facts and report the news with integrity and honesty, but however earnestly we strive for accuracy, that first draft of history is sometimes flawed. But interestingly and importantly, a poll commissioned by the US-based Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press showed that by admitting and correcting mistakes, that is the most single attribute that most people think is likely to build trust in media. So thank you to those of you who told us that we were wrong, and to those of you who continue to tell me that we're still not doing enough, or that what we are doing is simply insufficient. The reality is that we won't ever be able to satisfy some of you, but in that moment last summer, I promised that we would double down on our coverage of climate change, and 9 months on, I'm here this morning to tell you that we are delivering on that promise. I'm grateful too to so many people who stepped forward and offered to help make us better. Some of the world's leading scientists, like Peter Thorne from Maynooth, who was one of the lead authors for the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report. Peter ran a climate change reporting workshop for RTE journalists. Dave ran another. The EPA, who have offered to open up the riches of their scientific research to assist us in our reporting. And at RTE, we've also made a number of changes. Reporting climate change is everyone's beat. But after focusing on the pandemic for 2 years as science correspondent, last summer I announced that George Lee would lead our reporting and focus full-time as environment correspondent, and we've just heard about the importance of that. Primetime has upped its coverage of climate issues, broadcasting from Glasgow during COP26 at the end of last year, and last month broadcast the first of its climate specials. The 6-1 and Morning Island were also presented from Glasgow, and COP26 was the launching pad for us to engage younger audiences in RTE's coverage of climate issues through TikTok. And learning some of the lessons from the pandemic, we've created an online climate dashboard showing you every day how Ireland was powered over the last 24 hours, breaking down the percentages coming from renewable sources, gas, coal, and other sources, and importantly, showing where we need to get to meet our EU climate change commitments and where we're failing to do so. The Climate Vertical online and on the app houses hundreds of stories from the past year, and we don't just limit ourselves to stories about Ireland. You can see how our European partners are reporting climate change. RTE is one of 10 European broadcasters who are showcasing coverage of climate change issues and other things through a European perspective. We don't get everything right, and I recognise that there will be those of you for whom we'll never do enough. So amid the thanks, a plea. Please don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I recognise that we still have work to do, and science is changing all the time, and our reporting needs to continue to reflect that. And we've made a start. There's a long way to go. But I'm clear about my commitment to getting this right and the importance of public service journalism and the implications in that for RTE in terms of the responsibility to lead the conversation about the climate crisis and the impact it's having. And that, I believe, is exactly what we're doing, and it's exactly what we will continue to do. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you've got after the other speakers have spoken. Thanks very much.
I feel like my speech that I prepared is pretty much going to be backing up all of Dawn's research, so I feel like it's been stolen from me. But yeah, my name's Orla. I work as a reporter at the Journal. I've been there for almost 3 years now, and I work on climate primarily, but also other things like health, politics, social affairs, everything like that. And I've been on climate more so for about a year now, so I very much have the newbie kind of perspective of someone who maybe a year and a half ago wouldn't have been here, but very much wouldn't have known how to talk about climate in front of all of you. It's been really useful. The thing I've kind of learned the most about climate reporting is that it's really useful to have this climate knowledge to inform other reporting. So I think a lot of my other reporting has been strengthened very heavily by having all this climate knowledge. So the kind of pivotal moment, I suppose you could call it, for myself was I was listening to the radio one day and there was an interview talking about new plans for Dublin Airport. They were trying to bring, their flight levels back to pre-pandemic levels, so back to what it was in 2019, 2018, trying to get things back to normal, essentially. And, 2 years ago, I might have listened to that or seen a press release about it or whatever and thought, oh, that's not, cool, it's not that interesting, but, it's whatever. But now it's kind of thinking, well, okay, in this interview, it just went on about it and how it was exciting that it was getting all this and talking about plans for a new runway and everything like this, and kind of no questions about growth and how this is supposed to, compute with the halving emissions by 2030 and reducing to net zero by 2050. There were no questions about this, and there was no kind of questioning of this kind of business as usual attitude in this particular segment. And I just thought that was really interesting. And it gives you that new perspective to think about these kind of things in a new light. It gives you new angles and different questions to ask politicians that other reporters might not be thinking about, and that we all, as reporters, need to be thinking about going forward. Kind of the biggest learning curve for me over the past year was attending COP26 in Glasgow. So I was there for the 2 weeks, and that was kind of a trial by fire, I suppose, of being thrown in with all these other very experienced climate journalists who had been working in this sector for years and years and knew all about it, and experts as well who, again, have been in this for years and years and were more than helpful, and everyone was very encouraging and everyone's really, really helpful in that kind of sector and in that sphere. But there's a lot of jargon to get past, I suppose, when you're getting into the climate sector, as I'm sure a lot of you have experienced yourselves. There's a lot of terminologies that I would never have heard of before. Understanding Article 6 is probably one of the biggest achievements I will ever have. And there's just a lot of different things like that even if they don't come into your reporting all the time, you really need and will need more going forward as well. And that you can, as Dawn was kind of saying, you can communicate to your colleagues as well and say, look, this is a really important thing that we should know about. And it's been really helpful during COP26 as well, the fact that we had things like the Climate Action Plan coming in at the same time. We had a lot of other Irish news going on, and that really helps you from a reporter's perspective to say to your editors, and the editors of the Journal are great at listening to you and understanding the climate is really important and does need to be covered and given the kind of breadth that it deserves. And so having all of those things happening was really helpful to say, look, this is a really important thing that's happening. I need the space to cover it, and you need to help me do that. And kind of having those people, again, as you were outlining, having those people is really important to have this experience and have this knowledge. And at COP26, it was a very jarring experience. It's very strange to be surrounded by all these people. Again, it does feel like the business as usual attitude of all these negotiations and meetings going on by usually men in suits who are talking about climate change. And then you kind of go outside the UN zone and you see climate protesters and people, screaming about how their actual lives are going to be impacted by the decisions that are being made in these rooms. And as a relatively young person as well, it's very weird to think about that, because it was strange to be, speaking to older experts and politicians who are making these decisions, and they're talking about how their children or, their children's generation is going to be impacted by this. And I'm kind of sitting there with, a microphone, like that's kind of me. I'm kind of in that cohort, and as well speaking to activists who are the same age as you or older than you or younger than you, talking about how their lives are going to be impacted. It's kind of a strange dichotomy in that sense. And again, like was being outlined there, it is hard to separate that emotion more so than with other topics. You know, when you're covering politics, you're covering health. As a journalist, you are remaining impartial. You are staying outside of the story. But with climate change, it can be a bit more difficult to do that. I find that very overwhelming kind of at the start. I was trying to, more so outside of work than in work, but I was trying to read all these climate change books, all these Naomi Klein books and things like, you know, This Uninhabitable Earth, and just being very overwhelmed of spending all day talking about climate and then all evening reading about climate. And it kind of got me into that mindset that I know a lot of people experience of just feeling really overwhelmed and wanting to kind of ignore the issue and not think about it. And I know that is something a lot of people my age experience as well, from just talking to friends about saying, oh, I had this story come out, and they're like, yeah, I'll definitely read that. Like, I'll definitely get to that. But they're kind of not looking at climate change news because they feel like, oh, it's too late, and you know, there's only so much we can do at this point. We might as well live it up until that point and just adapt to what we can. And it kind of helps you get into that mindset that I really dislike, this very disheartening mindset that you try to combat through reporting. So that was kind of a really interesting part of it too. So there are a lot of challenges of getting involved in climate journalism. Again, I think the biggest part for me was just this jargon that you have to get past. There's so much knowledge that you need to know to just be able to do the bare minimum and just understand what's going on, and to attend, you know, to speak to ministers, to speak to politicians and understand what they're saying and how they're trying to, the words that they're using, and trying to get past that, you know, to even be able to ask those questions. You need to have this background level of understanding that, again, is going to be really important for every reporter to know. After COP26, then we kind of talked within ourselves in the newsroom about how we want to strengthen our climate coverage and how we want to add more to this sphere. And I was writing a newsletter at COP every day, and I found that kind of a really useful way to tackle this jargon and to kind of break down these different topics, because each day at COP was focused on a different theme, you know, whether it was gender, different things like that. And each day we would focus on a different topic. And I thought that was a really useful way to speak to experts and activists who were in these particular sectors, these different cohorts of climate, and really emphasize the interconnectedness of it all as well. The newsletter was just a really helpful way to do that. So we decided to start Temperature Check, which is our monthly climate newsletter that has been going on since January. And again, this has just been a really helpful way when things are a bit quieter in the climate sphere, which hasn't really happened so far this year, but we might get there. It's kind of a helpful way to continue this coverage and to bring it to the audience that's actually really interested in it too, while also continuing more general coverage as well at the same time, just to make it a bit more niche. And, you know, this was all going really well until we got to late February and obviously horrendous war in Ukraine. And that really shifted the focus as a newsroom. Like it did have that issue, very understandably and completely fairly, of completely taking over everything. You know, all of our news meetings were entirely focused on Ukraine. We were pushing our coverage on this and doing live vlogs and doing a lot of different rolling coverage and analysis of what was going on. And, you know, you all become kind of war reporters overnight from the comfort of your own home. So maintaining this focus was very difficult, particularly in the first couple of weeks. And it had the unfortunate timing of the IPCC Working Group 2 report coming out. It was a few days after the invasion. And again, it was just kind of sitting down with editors and saying, this is really big too, and also needs to be, you know, pushed out, and we need to be given time to work on this and give it the coverage that it deserves. And that was kind of, has been still difficult in the recent couple of months, of just maintaining this focus on these long-term issues and things that are hugely important and should be front page news all the time, even when there isn't a front page news thing happening in it. And obviously, you know, an explosion in Ukraine is going to take precedence over that in the short term. And kind of just communicating that has been really interesting and really difficult too. So I think this will be kind of the biggest focus going forward, is how to maintain this level of coverage, both in the short term and in the long term, and making sure it doesn't fall to the back seat at any stage, even when huge things are happening in the world elsewhere, because that's always going to be the case. There's always going to be something going on. We saw this as well with COVID, is that, you know, as well, climate reporting fell to the back seat too when COVID began, especially in 2020 and early 2021. It was the main focus in our newsroom too. You know, it was a huge thing to be focusing on. So I think that is going to be a challenge going forward. And I think there is a lot still to be done at the Journal and in other media organisations to prioritise climate reporting. And I'm really looking forward to being a part of that and hearing what you have to think on it. That's all.
Now for something completely different. So we've been talking a lot about journalism. So my area of research is on broader media, fictional media, documentaries, and all that sort of stuff. So journalism has a major role to play in climate communication, but media in general certainly has, and how to sort of engage with media in different ways. As Derek was saying at the start, trying to connect with literature, poetry, film, all the arts has a major role to play in sort of communicating this. So I've been doing this for a good number of years now, 20, 30 years, and I'm looking at greening media and environmental literacy and linking it to media literacy and how we can make connections between all that. Teaching modules, I teach on our masters in climate change, and I teach across a lot of areas, but I'm sort of interested in how media can be greened in various different ways, from its production to its consumption. So ways of improving strategies of communication and keeping it simple is what PR scholars always say. Keep it simple. Try to get the message across. The problem we have with climate change is it is so complicated. And we keep saying the mantra is everything is connected. So all the sciences are connected. All sorts of areas are connected. And trying to find those connections is difficult, as our colleagues were saying about how journalists have a very difficult role to play in trying to communicate this. So building on sustainability is obviously, everyone knows sustainability is the buzzword that we talk a lot about now. We sort of always, as was said at the very start, as Harry was saying, companies need to be sustainable environmentally, and so does the media industry. So the media industry needs to get its act together as well in reducing its carbon footprint. So what I've been involved in for the last couple of years was looking at, I've set up an organisation called Green Screening, where we've sort of got all the organisations, including RTE, TV3, TG Car, as well as film companies and the funding organisations, all to come together to sort of try and reduce their carbon footprint, try and find ways of making the media industries more sustainable. So it's easy to preach, but you need to get your own house in order as well. So building a sustainable film making industry and a television industry needs to be done to speak truth to power in lots of ways. So this coalition was really unique, and it's quite unique in European terms. There's no other country that has all the funding agencies, the television companies, the film industry, all working on the same level and trying to sort of see how we can green our industry. So it's been quite an original sort of process. And to do that, we've used the Albert calculator from the BBC, which is a calculator that sort of measures the carbon footprint of television programs, filmmaking and documentaries, and sort of learning how to sort of then reduce their carbon footprint is what it's all about. So if you watch your TV, you'll watch EastEnders and you'll see the Albert thing at the end of the program. So you can get a kite mark then when you sort of follow the protocol and try to reduce your carbon footprint. So it's a model of sort of where the media industries can get involved in all this and do something that's of benefit that we all need to get involved in. In regards to that, we've just in the last couple of weeks, my colleague Brenda and I have been involved in doing a case study for an EU project where we're trying to sort of green European production and media production generally as a sort of an added advantage, sort of to give it a sort of a more competitive edge by greening its production, sort of so using that as a model. So we're trying to link up with other European countries, other media organizations, and to try and sort of do that as a major EU project that would sort of feed into, obviously most of us here know about the Green New Deal, but all industries need to sort of work on greening their organizations and their corporate governance. So how to do that most effectively is something that we as practitioners and as environmental scholars need to get involved in as well. So it's something that's new to the area, but it's something I'm particularly interested in. Where I'm most happiest is in just analysing film. That's my bag of tricks and has been for the last 20 or 30 years. How to read narratives and storytelling from across the whole range of filmmaking and documentaries, and how they can produce environmental messages. And these are not just films that are explicitly about environmental issues. Implicitly, nearly all narratives can have an environmental subtext, to use the bullshitty term. So we do try to communicate, all communication, and whether it's food, whether it's energy, it all comes back to environmental issues that feed into so many stuff. So how can mass audiences, how can media speak to mass audiences? The real problem we have with environmental communication is that we're speaking to the converted, usually with you guys. But it's how to speak to people who are not really interested or don't see the connection with environmental issues. That's where the real issue and the real challenge is. And I think fictional narratives can help do that, as well as documentaries, as well as journalism. We need all media attributes working on that. So we can look at the power of film to communicate climate change. The key focus, as Derek was saying at the very start, we're all storytellers. Storytelling is the number one way to communicate any message. And climate change certainly needs the power of storytelling. And as a film scholar, we love visual spectacle, to immerse yourself into a story. So what stories can be very effective, or how can they work? We were talking earlier about, the climate change is a scientific, it's a rational problem. We know about numbers, but some of us are not that numerate. We connect with other parts of our bodies. Our senses are as important as our rationality. We need to connect with all parts of the human being to actually communicate. As Harry was saying earlier, how do we communicate? How do we get people from stop smoking? I mean, it's not rational to smoke, but people do. So it's complicated. Everything about human beings is complicated, and that's where storytelling can help. And the word we use a lot is new creative imaginaries. We need new ways of telling stories. So RTE, everyone that's telling stories, from journalists to whoever, has to find new ways of telling that story to connect with people. And if you can do that, then you will start the conversation and you will get communication working. We're also involved in audience research. So we love doing audience research because it's easy to pontificate about textual analysis and telling how people read films. But when we start analysing how audiences really read films, then we can hear different things. So we have to worry about preaching and how to communicate. Some of my books, I began my research with Hollywood Utopia, where I looked at mainstream Hollywood films and how they communicated environmental issues. And I've continued that beat, to use a journalist term, right up to the current day, but I've diversified into different areas. So greening cinema. So that we need a better understanding of how to communicate more effectively. We need to investigate how people's attitudes, perceptions, and behaviours are stimulated by environmental ecological debates. We have a real tension, the literature will show, attitudinal change is easier than behavioural change. It's how to marry the two. We all want to be greener, but do we do it, is the question. So how do we connect with different types of green audiences? How can we all become more environmentally connected? And what impact has the media? And the media, as a film scholar, I see the media as having a major role to play in this, in mobilising public opinion, in trying to activate the change that is so urgent, as Dave was saying at the very start. So we tried to green audience research. We looked at the different attitudes and creating environmental and active literacy and all that stuff. I'm just aware of time, so I'm going to speed up through this. What I'm just ending up with is a small case study of a film that Dave and I are going to look at and do some analysis on. Don't Look Up, which I'm sure most of you have seen. I hope if you haven't, please see it. I'll put a teaser at the end. But a big problem we have in environmental communication is that it's such a serious problem in climate change. Can we really use parody, pastiche, piss take to connect with audiences? Yes, we can. And sometimes that can be very effective. So this film that came out at Christmas, Don't Look Up, is a sort of really split audiences and split sort of as it will show in it. Just a sort of, all I'm doing is a quick overview of some reviews on this film. That's my academic add to the literature in today. So I'll just sort of get to it quickly. So hopefully you've seen. So Hilary White affirmed in the Sunday Independent, beneath the sharp wit and roll call of big-name stars, McKay depicts moral bankruptcy and far-reaching system collapse, which they can bring about. The climate crisis fits that bill perfectly. Only the send-up will require a slightly more fanciful approach. After all, the system's collapse this time is a potentially existential one. Harry was talking about the existential crisis of climate change, and we keep using that term. Prepare to wince as it shows up our species seizing anything, celebrity, gossip, consumerism, party politics, to distract from the impending catastrophe. So how we use different coping mechanisms, and Don't Look Up is sending that up and sending up that sort of strategies that people use not to face up to the reality. Absurdism is built into the premise of films like Don't Look Up. We can look back to Beckett and the use of different sort of strategies to create communication, which is very different. But how do we use comedy to speak to climate change? It's something that I would be interested in. So how do these issues play out in the so-called attention deficit world we live in? We have students, are they really connected to climate change? A lot of them are. We have some, as I say, our masters in climate change. We have lots of undergraduates who are really committed to this issue. How can they turn the dial, as we say, to sort of make things happen? Someone called David Robbins in the Irish Times, in the online version, talked about how he affirms how critics of Don't Look Up should look at it through a different lens, many of who are very critical of the film. I would be that person who is very critical of the film. I would argue as a film scholar, it's trying to do too much. It's hitting too many issues, so it doesn't work as a coherent film. Who cares about me? It's not for me that it's been made. This is part of how we have to be humble in understanding how media works for different audiences, different strokes for different folks. For those in the climate science sphere, however, it's more than a movie, it's a redemptive event, according to some scientists. They loved it. Rolling Stone said it was a blunt instrument instead of a sharp razor. Do we need both to communicate blunt instruments and sharp razors to communicate issues like climate change? Sight and Sound said it was broad, crass, scattergun comedy. Really dismissive term. Screen International accused it of being smug and self-satisfied. A stinging comment from the Fox News review captured the response of many of the film press. If I want to be preached at, I go to the church. So this endless sort of worry that the climate change is we're the new priesthood. We're preaching. And that really turns off audiences. How do you communicate climate change without having that tone of, I have an electric car, therefore I'm better than you? The sort of virtue signaling game that goes on in climate communication. But of course, we can't just sit back and watch what's happening on the planet. We are not the audience. Like or not, we are the story. So, you know, the metaphor that we often use in climate change is we are the enemy. So, if it was, you know, in narrative terms, we're the problem. So how do we make that effective as a communication sort of agenda? Okay, for time. Environmentalists, not really. Okay, so we will just get rid of it there. We need more creative imaginaries. We need more ways of communicating. And the role of humanities and storytelling, as Derek says, is absolutely central. Humanities and social science has a major role to play in climate communication because we're all storytellers. Thank you very much. And that's the film. See it when you can. If you haven't seen it, you haven't lived. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the panel and for everyone putting on this event. My question is about the media, journalism and advertising. When I was reading the IPCC 6 report on the New York Times, it was brought to me by ExxonMobil when I was reading the Irish Times' latest editorial on climate change. On the front page of the newspaper was an advert for a private jet. And when I'm looking at excellent RT reporting from the likes of Philip Boucher-Hage or George Lee, quite often immediately followed by an advert for a TV to get around the gridlock streets of Dublin. And it feels very jarring that when I read these excellent journalist pieces, that immediately I'm served an ad for something that's highly carbon polluting, often for the top 5 or 1%, can distract from the journalism itself. So given what we know from the UN, from scientists, from the WHO, 7 million deaths per year pollution, is one of the actions that the media can take to respond to climate change is to stop accepting the adverts for disproportionately luxury, high carbon polluting products.
Thanks very much. Paul Price from DCU. I'd just like to say it's very good we have moved on from 5-10 years ago when, you'd had John Gibbons being trying to communicate actual climate action stuff and climate reality, and we had climate deniers up against him. What I'd like to point out, though, is that just to push back at the idea that there are fringe actors that climate people or communicators should stay away from. We should face up to the fact that inaction is at the core of our society, and it's inactivists with money and power and directed expertise who are really at the core of resisting change and resisting the kind of action we need. And I'm wondering how media addresses that. And so, fringe actors are one thing, but really the core of inaction is right at the core of our society in their vested interests in fossil fuels, in agriculture, and so forth. And how does media address that? And that speaks to the previous question too.
Maybe if we take the advertising one first. I don't know, John, maybe you'd like to speak to that one.
Yeah. Well, look, whether it's the New York Times or whether it's RTE, the commercial side of the business is insulated from the editorial side of the business. And I have no role in deciding what adverts go out in the middle of the 6-1 news. Where I do have influence is around the website and, for example, on budget day sponsorship of the website. And I'm very clear that the news has to be protected. And as far as I'm concerned, you pay your license fee to support RT News and Current Affairs. The commercial advertising that RT takes funds things like Dancing with the Stars and the Champions League. There is a difference, I think, between, there's an interesting conversation, and the president has been very vocal about sports betting, for example, and advertising around betting and the dangers that has on society. There is a conversation to be had, I think, about taking money from organizations and practices that actively harm individuals, as opposed to one particular brand of motor vehicle. But all I would say is that if we want to be able to be ambitious in our reporting of climate change, or we want to be ambitious in terms of what RT is able to do, at the end of the day, there are bills to be paid. And unfortunately, Ireland is not a large enough country to support a fully license fee funded public service broadcaster. And so there will have to be advertising. And if there has to be advertising, there are then choices to be made. But all I can promise you is that there is, in exactly the same way as there is at the New York Times or anywhere else, a complete firewall between the editorial side of the house and the commercial side of the house.
Okay, thank you, John. we're really up against the clock here. I don't know if anybody wants to take on the question about we are now faced with kind of the forces of delay rather than denial. Would you want to talk about that, Orla?
Yeah, again, coming to it from kind of a newer perspective, what I found is just maintaining that absolute skepticism that you need throughout all facets of journalism, and now particularly in climate journalism, because just really thinking about why is this person saying this, and particularly if you're working on a certain story and someone says, no, that's not a story, or no, I don't think that's interesting, or, we already talked about this 5 years ago, you don't need to look into this. That's always kind of a key of like, no, I should definitely look into this. It's kind of, they're saying this for some particular reason, kind of looking into their background, seeing what their vested interests are, where they might have worked previously. I think it's just maintaining that skepticism, because you'll get a million emails a day from companies telling you how they're going to go net zero by 2050. And, again, airlines telling you they're going to be net zero in 10 years, and kind of maintaining that absolute skepticism of what exactly are you saying here? Who are you, and why are you telling me this? Like, why are you saying this to me as well? That kind of skepticism, I think, essentially.
Okay. I'm really sorry the Q&A was so short. I'm not sure who overran their time. I'll check back on the tape. So I'd like the panelists for some really, really fascinating and stimulating contributions. Maybe we could give them a little round of applause.